Okay, well, thanks for letting me speak in this session. And I really appreciate both Abigail and Ian with their talks because I'm not fully awake yet, and I need all the help I can get in terms of remembering lots of stuff. And I'm joking, obviously, but I would like to say that while they were talking, I was thinking about my slides, and I've added a little bit of stuff to my slides to kind of like take some of the thoughts that they had and the comments that they had and actually think about them in the context of what I'm going to show you, which is basically a data management plan that I put together for a research project that I have going on right now that will go on through the end of next year. So I'm a chemist, I'm an analytical chemist by training, but in the last over 10 years, I have transitioned into being a chemical informatician and very, very interested in fair and open data. And that led me to the idea about how to pull together data from different heterogeneous sources and make them more fair. And I'm not going to talk about the actual nuts and bolts of the project that I'm on because I don't have time, but what I did want to show was the very quick snapshot here on the first screen, first slide of the actual project and its title. Basically, this was a project to develop an open framework for nominally being able to house fair data. So the project itself is all about fair. And in terms of thinking about data management plans, probably the most important statement that's on this slide is actually the quote that is underneath the title, where it says journal papers should be supplements to data. Now, Barrett Mons is basically the head guy, or at least the point person relative to FAIR, because he was involved in the original discussions that developed the idea. But what I like about this statement is if you are not necessarily doing FAIR or making your data fair right now, and you want to get into doing that and making your data available for others to reuse, this thought is a great thought to have in your mind as you start down this path of coming up with a data management plan. Because if you come from the perspective that is more traditional, which is where the journal article kind of like is the research product, then it's very difficult to wrap your head around what you need to do in a data management plan, because that's not really the perspective that you need to have in order to be able to really make your data fair to whatever level is appropriate. So starting out in this project, I had to do exactly this. I had to think about, okay, this is a fair project, but I should not be thinking about the papers that I want to write relative to this project first. I should be thinking about the data that I'm going to actually put out there in the community, and then write the papers about that data. And so this is a very different way to think about things. And if you can get to the point of actually coming to this conclusion and thinking about this for what you're doing, then it's a great starting point. In addition, if you are going to write a proposal that then needs a data management plan, which is probably not 100% of proposals that you might write, but it's probably very, very common these days. This is a great book that was published by the US National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine on the idea of open science by design. And by the title, you can exactly get what this is about. It's about turning the paradigm on its head and thinking first about what you do being more open rather than obviously closed, as maybe we could think of maybe more traditional ways of doing research. I've just come up with some highlights from this document, but it basically focuses on, well, what do you need to do and what do you need to think about relative to being fair, and in particular thinking about how do you make your science open? How do you reinvent what you do in a way that means that the science that you do can be put out there front and center based off of the data that you produce? I would really encourage everybody to have a look at this. It's a free download from the website, and it has a lot of really, really interesting thoughts in it that allow you to kind of rethink how you do what you do in terms of research. So based on my experience writing this data management plan, which I'm going to go through in a little bit here, it's important for me to think about, well, what questions are the most important when I'm thinking about doing this? And this is by no means all of them, but these are the ones that are maybe higher on the list. First of all, think about what resources that you have that are available to help you be fair. Right now, there's a lot of development going on in the community where there are tools and services and even software that can maybe not completely support everything you want to do in terms of putting your data out, but they can certainly, aid the process. And so obviously you want to leverage those if you can. Internally in your organization, you may want to reach out to your IT department and maybe other support departments and partner with somebody in that group to be able to really develop the infrastructure to support your data needs. You can't, as was mentioned before by Abigail, you can't do this all on your own. And it is a community effort, but it's also, it's a community effort both outside of your institution, but also inside. Now, one of the things I had to think about, although thankfully not as important to me, was, how is this idea about being fairer going to impact my research productivity? Going into my grant that I wrote this data management plan for, I had already come to the conclusion that this is what I wanted to do, and so, I was willing to accept, whatever kind of impact there was on my research productivity. But clearly, if you are a faculty member in an institution and you in the US need to be able to go to tenure and get promoted, this is something that's a very important question because implementing good data management practices takes time, it takes effort, and it takes resources and even training, of course, because there are probably going to be people in your lab that do not have any perspective on this, and you have to retrain them about how to deal with their data. That leads to the fourth bullet here, which is you've got to get buy-in from your employees, whether they be students or postdocs or even collaborators that you may have, because if not everybody, if everybody isn't on board, then it'll make it more difficult to do this. And do you have any fears about this? There are many situations where researchers that do relatively high level research, may be concerned about IP protection or just the main general scoop of a research finding that could lead to some award or something like that. And there are ways you can mitigate that by embargoes, for instance, as was mentioned. So, you've got to think about, what do you want this to look like at the end, if you can hopefully visualize it. And then finally, it's also important to make sure, again, as Abigail, I think, pointed out, that you want to identify data that is not going to be open, that you do not want to share, either because it's not useful to the community or because it's sensitive in some way. I realize there's a lot of text on here, but I will make my slides available, and I'll also make available a copy of the data management plan that I'm referencing here. You've got to think about your data management plan up front. One of the things that I think is really useful is to take some of your own data, give it to someone that has not worked with you, but is familiar with the research area, and ask them to reuse it. Ask them to do something with it, and find out if they can do it. And if they can't do it, what's missing? What data would they need to be able to accurately reuse or appropriately reuse your data? That leads to many, many interesting findings I've seen. Don't worry about technology changes when you're thinking about a data management plan. Software and online services, change constantly. It's a really big moving landscape, and so kind of focus more on what you will do, on about how you will do things, rather than necessarily what exactly you will use. But of course, you do need to include appropriate examples just to demonstrate that you know the kinds of resources that you would be using in the actual project. If you have the time, if you're not working too hard against the deadline for submitting a grant proposal, for instance, give your data management plan to your IT support team if you have one. They're hopefully going to be involved in implementing the kinds of things that you need to do, and let them have a look at it and tell you what's viable or what's missing or unclear. Because if you don't have their support / the resources that you need, of course, this is going to become more complicated. And then this is a point that I did add while I was listening to the first two talks. Think broadly about your data. We've had to do this in my group. Initially, I had really thought that the data we were talking about here was the converted crosswalked data that we're producing as a part of the project. But in fact, we're now thinking about this much more broadly and are going to put out software we develop, scripts that we've used to do different conversions of pieces of data, and even full databases that we've created as a part of actually putting the information out. So it's not just the experimental data. It's really nominally everything, or at least everything that you think is appropriate to help the community understand your data and or potentially reuse your data if there's something more specific in how it's processed. And so that will really help the R in FAIR. So other things to think about: describe how and where you will log the data that you collect. If you're like me, you have a lot of data and it's being generated by a lot of people, then you've got to have some way to centrally keep track of all of that. There's no point in trying to go backwards over time. And even a regular lab notebook sometimes is not good enough, or at least it's difficult to be able to go through to be able to get that log of how and where, when the data was collected, because slight differences in how people keep a lab notebook. Detail what formats the data will be collected in. I would say, in a general sense, make those text-based, and then you can worry about maybe more specific formats from there, whether it be XML, JSON, or JSON LD, for instance, as examples. Clearly identify how your data is going to be accessible. So what you nominally plan to do with that data, whether you're going to put it online or whether it's going to be an institutional repository. Describe your policies for sharing data. How will you back up your data? This is internal, but of course is really important in terms of making sure you keep the different versions of data. And so you may also need to come up with naming conventions for data, both in terms of folders and in individual files, and thinking about, well, what compression algorithm might you use in order to be able to keep a set of data together. So just, making sure that that is set up in a way that is documented, but then also is implemented, that you can go back and you can look at the historical record of how your data has evolved. How will you archive the data from the project? In a general sense, you can put out individual data sets, but it may be appropriate for you to actually create one comprehensive archive of all the data that you put out, plus maybe some additional data that would be supplemental to that you wouldn't normally put out, but it would be really useful to contextualize what you did and how you did it in the context of you going back and looking at that archive later on, or somebody else going back and looking at that, and or using it as a template for how they might set up a data management plan. Make sure you tell collaborators about how you're going to deal with IP issues. And one of the things, again, that I added listening to the other talks, is there a clear need to develop software to help adding metadata? Again, if you're going to be data first, you've got to think of, well, what are the resources that I need to be able to enable that more easily in my group? And that may be that you need to develop a piece of software to help your group actually add the metadata to describe the data that is being collected. One of the things I've seen in many situations is that scientists like to keep lab notebooks, but as far as actually the whole idea of metadata in a digital sense, they're very much less enthusiastic about that because it seems to be never ending. And so limiting the scope, but making it appropriate for the metadata that you capture alongside your data is a really good thing. After the fact, thinking about the data management plan that I put together for my grant, we didn't get it right. And probably you won't get it completely right either. And so obviously you need to be flexible and think about how to improve your data management as you go through the process. And my examples here are about the kinds of tools that we've used, and in particular focusing on code. One of the things we're developing is code that is needed to be able to crosswalk the data that we start with into the final data that we will release. Well, if you want others to be able to understand what you've done and or potentially reproduce it, you need to release that code. And so we're now doing that with a couple of code projects that we have. And we've set it up so that in particular through Zenodo, you can set up creation of DOIs for different versions of that code, so that if somebody in the community uses the code in research that they're doing, they can actually reference to the specific version of that code to be able to represent exactly how they processed it. So again, that could be reproduced. And in addition to that, we're even talking about, as you can see here, creating Jupyter notebooks to be able to run some of this code. This is all in Python. And then putting those out there so that people can actually analyze things, but just see how we went through the process. And even the idea of Docker, which will allow us to publish kind of like a complete system of code with data so that people can actually see it in action without a lot of necessarily expertise in the code. So, so the data management plan is not a static thing. As long as you think about the fact that once you've got it in place, that you do need to revisit regularly to think about, does it need to be updated? Then you will end up with the best of possible worlds once you're done in terms of the sharing of your data. So with that, like I said, I'll be happy to share a copy of the data management plan plus these slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.